Justice Umwe, once again, we welcome you to the interview. As I indicated earlier on, I will ask you 4 standard questions before I hand you over to the commissioners if they have questions to ask you. The first question is as follows. Supreme Court decisions become part of the law of the land. Supreme Court judges should therefore be thinking of making law and not simply deciding matters before them on appeal. How does this statement affect the application of the principle of the rule of law by the Supreme Court?
Yes, I think the answer to that question revolves around the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It being the final court of appeal, it is the responsibility of not just making the decision of the matter before it, but also of trying by all means to craft a judgment which will bind not just itself and the parties before it, but also aimed at developing law and being the guide for the lower courts, that is the High Court and other lower courts as well. Secondly, being the final court of appeal in all cases decides only those matters for which the Constitutional Court is exclusive jurisdiction. It is important for the Supreme Court to make sure that it removes all doubt that might be lingering around the issue before the particular matter before it, and sets a precedent which is easier to follow, easier to understand, and easier to apply.
You are done.
Yes.
The second question is as follows. State 3 fundamental principles governing the exercise of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. State 1, each principle is important in defining the relationship between the Supreme Court and other courts.
The first principle, I think, is the same principle that the Lordship has referred to, which is the rule of law. It is important for the exercise of its powers in terms of Section 176, which describes the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, to ensure that in all the matters that it presides over, not only does it maintain the principle of or the principle relating to the rule of law, but also to ensure that it covers all those matters which will impact on the issues before it. The second principle, I think, is it is clothed with the duty to set a standard in terms of precedence. And therefore, in its decisions, it will have to ensure that whatever decision it makes is consistent with not just its jurisdiction, but also with the principles set out as the guiding principles guiding the judiciary in terms of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, which principles are set out in Section 2 of the Constitution, as well as Section 126, which require the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but all courts, to develop both common law international obligations which the Republic of Zimbabwe has in terms of international law, so as to ensure that whatever decisions or interpretation that is given to whatever to law does not contradict states' responsibilities in terms of those obligations to which Zimbabwe is part of. So the principle coming out of that would be to have regard to what international law says in respect of whatever measures are being placed before the Supreme Court. If at all that matter has any impact or any argument has been raised in terms of international law.
The third question is as follows. Why is it necessary that each member of the bench sitting to hear and determine a case in the Supreme Court be fully prepared for the case? If appointed to the Supreme Court, how do you intend to manage a situation where you would hold a different opinion on a question of law from the other members of the bench with whom you sit to hear a case?
The first thing one must do when we are sitting in a bench which is constituted by more than one person is to understand the matter before you discuss the matter with your colleagues. And therefore, a thorough understanding of the issues raised in the case will be very, very critical in your understanding of what it is that the bench is being asked to pronounce itself on. Once you understand the facts and the law that is being indicated, it is then easier to discuss with your colleagues and express your views with respect to those issues. In the event that you might share a different view, you would have to justify your views to your colleagues in a manner that does not offend your colleagues, but in a manner which is aimed at the principles that I have already adverted to, which is developing the law as a bench and furthering the interests of law development.
You are done. The fourth question and the last question is as follows. What responsibility, if any, should a judge of the Supreme Court who wrote a judgment to which his or her colleagues concurred have when the judgment is severely criticized by the public? In what way is public criticism of judicial decisions an important means of ensuring judicial accountability?
Once a judge has written the opinion of the court on behalf of that court, that decision becomes the decision of that court, not of the judge. It might draw adverse comments, criticisms, or debates. It is not up to the particular judge who has written that particular judgment to defend that judgment, but it is up to the court to accept that criticism and maybe try to address those issues when they are properly placed before it in a subsequent judgment. The advantage, I think, that flows from being on the Supreme Court bench is that the Supreme Court is able to go back on its own earlier decisions unlike other courts. Being the final court, appellate court, it can revise its own previous decision and accept that, in fact, in such a case we took this view, we now believe that that view was erroneous in this respect. And therefore, as a court, it can still justify its walking back on a decision if the situation requires it to do so. Judicial accountability does not requires a court to be able to give a judgment which is fairly reasoned, which is founded in law and based on the facts. It does not imply that a criticism of a judgment should not be is not permitted, and therefore judicial accountability requires a court to be able to acquit itself in the manner in which it gives reasons for its decision, whether it's an order or a judgment or a directive, which implies that for any decision, any order, any directive, there must be reasons to justify that order, decision, or judgment.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I have one or two questions for you, Judge. Could you kindly highlight to us a key reform? Sorry, I'll start again. Could you kindly highlight to us a key reform in the judicial system that you believe would increase access to justice for all? Perhaps you could give us an example of any action that you might have taken in support of this reform.
I think access to justice is an important principle to which the Constitution speaks. However, there is a lot of our procedural rules restrict access, especially to the Supreme Court, because being a court of appeal, its access is obviously restricted to only those parties which were party to the litigation in a lower court or in a lower tribunal. However, there may be instances where litigants are unable themselves to prosecute an appeal, although they might be in argument for case. And therefore, I think when one looks at Section 85 of the Constitution, which permits an approach by certain categories of individuals to the Constitutional Court, in my view, it must be possible for any party who believes that an approach to the Supreme Court or to any other court would be warranted to use the provisions of Section 85 of the Constitution to approach any court if their cases are merit. I have no example to give off the cuff in that regard, but I think public litigation is an area which is rich with that type of case in which members of the public should be able to utilize to get a quick decision on a matter which is of public importance, rather than to wait for a matter to start at the High Court, the appeal to the Supreme Court. If there's a constitutional court, an issue arising, then approach the Constitutional Court. In my view, it should be possible for a party who feels that this matter is of supreme public importance, of constitutional importance, to be able to approach a court which he thinks or she thinks could give a decision which would have some sort of finality, reducing the appeal process.
Thank you. My second question, as a judge, you are often subjected to public criticism. In your view, how should public criticism be managed by the judiciary?
Yes, I think that it is important for the judiciary to have a platform where the public criticism is addressed, which lacks right now. I would suggest that the Judicial Service Commission appoints not just a public relations office, but that office must be equipped to be able to handle public criticism, not just of the judgments themselves, but of conduct by judges, and be able to interpret or to explain to the public whatever conduct might be perceived by the public to be out of order. I say this in light of the fact that we see and read about all this criticism in the media. But as judges, we are hamstrung in terms of being able to respond. And the perception sometimes crystallizes into the facts, and that might actually tarnish the judiciary when it is not necessary, when an issue could have been addressed as soon as it was raised by an appropriate office, because we usually resort to the default position that a judge only speaks through his judgments, but there are matters in which a judge ought to be defended, or a judge's action must be explained to the public so that they understand how a judge acted in a particular manner. There are so many current issues, for example, the way in which certain matters related are pending in the courts, which the public's perception is that either the High Court or some other courts are letting the public down by not doing enough. There must be an office which should be able to handle those matters, explain a judgment at least, how a judge has come to a certain conclusion, so that the judge is shielded from unnecessary and untrue criticism.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, CJ. Honorable Judge, could you please walk us through an incident in which your integrity and or your professionalism was severely tested? What happened and what did you do? Is what I would like to understand.
I'm not sure what the person requires me to address.
I just want to understand whether at some stage in your career as a judge, you had an incident where your professionalism and your integrity has been tested. And if you could then describe that incident, what the incident had been, and what was your reaction?
Yes, the one that comes to mind relates to the Mzinze case. And there are other various cases. The Judicial case comes to mind. I was criticized in the press for holding report at my farm, but I think the Law Society explained exactly the case tended to cast my conduct in very likely terms of not having delivered sentence some 8 years later. What the report did not highlight was that a judge is not dominant lives in criminal cases. It is up to the prosecutor general's office to bring matters before a judge or the magistrate. And that was lost to the public because it was an impression was created that in fact I had acted with such tardiness that I did not deserve to hold the office of the judge. But when the opportunity presented itself for me to respond to that, which was of course through a judgment, I gave the chronology of the events as they unfolded, and the Constitutional Court gave an appropriate order which I think was this issue. But as I said, already the impression had already been created out there, and for other motives than proper ethical motives. They were not meant to correct a situation in which somebody was sitting in prison, but they were only meant to cast him in the light. I thought that it was more of a political gamesmanship than anything else. But I think that matter was put to rest, as was the matter relating to the granting of the vote, which became a matter of public interest and it was a basic article. And as I said, it is important to an office which always comes to the rescue of the judiciary by explaining how these matters are supposed to be professionally.
My second question relates to your career. What do you believe has been the obstacles in your career and how have you handled them?
My career, yes, I think it's all about perception. As I said, sometimes perception crystallizes into facts. And once you have a perception by those that are supposed to stand in judgment of your career, once there's that perception, they tend to reflect you in a different light than what you actually are. And what I've done was merely to leave the whole matter of the public to judge, and my judgments to speak for themselves, rather than for me to justify myself, and I have not had any problem.
Thank you.
You are a very experienced judge. Okay, I thought you've been there for some time now, and that experience shows in the judgments that you write. I want to start from that positive, not a good judgment.
Thank you.
My question is, do you interest yourself in what happens to some of your judgments that are appealed against or even overturned by the Supreme Court?
Yes, certainly. Actually, I was one of the people one of the judges who raised the issue that we are not getting from what happens to our judgments who have been appealed. We need to keep track so that we address those issues that are raised by the appellate courts in the judgments that will be subsequent to a case in which my judgment will be overturned.
Thank you, Judge. I'll just speak on just two of such judgments. And I think in all fairness to also allow you to comment if you need to do so, as I will also present it to the Commission. One of the cases is Zimbabwe United Passenger Company versus Parkhouse Services, which was overturned on appeal. And the major reason is that that decision was not based on the evidence before the court. You are aware of that appeal judgment?
No, I'm not aware of that appeal judgment.
Another one is the Judicial Service Commission itself, ZIBANI. You have had occasion to go through that appeal judgment.
Yes.
That judgment is parts which maybe I want to highlight to you for your comment. On one part it says, it follows that the court gravely and grossly misdirected itself in finding that the first respondent had any prima facie or other right, and by consequently granting the interim relief sought by him. The words they gravely and grossly, don't you think maybe are an indictment in how you are in your ability to make judgments? I might also maybe refer you to another page in the same judgment. It says, in short and with all due respect, the reasoning and judgment of the court are all defined logic and all established tenets of constitutional law. Sitting here now to look at this judgment, do you have any comment on that judgment, which was also overturned your judgment was overturned on appeal?
Yes, I have. I think that judgment is an expression of opinion of the writer. I think that was associated. And I do not accept that the qualification that he uses about my ability to assess the facts that will be before me. And I also still hold dearly the fact that I applied and amended the fact that will be before me and issued in all honesty my reasons for having found the way I found. What I think might be lost to the reader of that judgment is that that case is not only hinged on constitutional issues, it hinged on corporate governance. And I sincerely believe that those are issues which are still alive today, which haven't been addressed. As we sit here, can I give an example, Commissioner Michu? I see before me 3 commissioners who come who competently be sitting where I'm sitting. That is Commissioner, Honorable Judge President, Commissioner Schumann. If for any reason they wish to put their names up, how would the Commission have been able to constitute itself and interview the Commissioners as candidates? And I honestly believe that it's an issue which is still alive, which must be dealt with. The politics of it aside, I don't believe that we can completely ignore it simply because the Supreme Court found against me in that judgment.
Thank you, Judge. As I said, I wanted to give you the opportunity to address it. The part of what I'm saying, your experience and so on, is also seen you seconded to the court in Lesotho. I understand you are currently there, and what aspects of your experiences in sitting there in the court in Lesotho could prove to be of advantage, as particularly if you are now going to be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court?
Well, the first thing is that the infusion of international jurisprudence is being taken further by my being seconded to the High Court of Lesotho. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that as nations in SADC, we need to have a common approach to judicial governance issues. And my being in Lesotho, I think, is a learning experience, not just for myself, but also for the judiciary, because they are drawing from what I'm bringing to them and learning how where to improve if there's anything to improve in their system. And I believe that the Honorable Chairman of the Commission is problem with it, actually just of Lesotho and the advice of the same.
Thank you, Judge. My next question relates to delays in passing judgments, and I also want to give you the opportunity to address this so that we objectively look at it. Because sometimes it's your circumstances as a judge that can explain it. You explained very well in terms of sometimes partly heavy matters that the judge is not the dominant witness. But when it comes to reserved judgments, what is your view on that? Can we safely, as a commission, I need your help in this, can we safely, as a commission, rely on an analysis of the length with which someone
Yes, I don't think it's a good measure of someone's capacity or capability because if you look at the judicial code of conduct for Zimbabwean judges, it sticks to 90 days. But my experience is that that was too idealistic and too hopeful for various reasons. Firstly, it's no secret that I'm speaking about the High Court. It's severely understaffed. There is more litigation that is coming up and that puts the High Court bench on tremendous pressure. And secondly, not every case is the same, so that you can use the 90-day standard to measure judges' capacity to deliver judgment. There will be reasons why there will be difference in terms of the complexities of the issues involved in a particular matter, which might require a judge to put that matter aside and do some more research, more than what has been placed before in argument by the parties themselves. Then comes the issue of personal circumstances of judges. One must understand that as judges, I think the youngest judge can only be 40 and not younger. And we are not getting any younger as we stay on the bench. And therefore, we meet and we suffer a lot of personal problems, health-wise, family commitments, and so on and so forth. And those might actually come into a judge's way in terms of the promptness of judgment delivery. So there are so many factors, and it would have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, so that the only person who would understand what is happening to a particular judge would be the judges immediately in charge of the particular division of the court. For instance, the judge president would be able to understand and explain what the judge is explaining the state of a particular case was, rather than looking at a list of undelivered judgments and measuring it against the standard of 90 days.
Thank you, Judge. Another aspect that I want to also take the opportunity to commend you on is the furtherance of your education. I understand you recently graduated with a master's, and you are doing another master's in law, if I'm correct, Judge. At the moment, the emphasis in your current studies is on human rights. And I noticed that in your judgments, you have made human rights, an aspect that must underpin the judgments that you are laying down. How far do you think, as a Supreme Court judge, you do engage issues of human rights and in the judgments that you are going to make?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, God willing, I will be graduating in December in my master's of law. I've already said, get another degree, which I changed a few years ago. Coming to your question as to how that will assist in Supreme Court, one must always understand that sitting in the Supreme Court, you sit as a panel on each and every case. But I think that my presence will enhance the court's perception in terms of how to deal with human rights issues vis-à-vis the constitutional provisions, how to interpret the constitutional provisions, insofar as the state obligations in terms of those instruments to which Zimbabwe is a state party.
Thank you, Judge. And my last question. In an environment of political polarization, how does the judge, particularly of the Supreme Court, seek to engender the perception that the judiciary is independent and influence from politicians is impartial and he has integrity.
You would have noticed that in all my answers, I have always tried, wherever it was possible, to underpin my responses on a constitutional basis. And I believe that the Constitution is the protector of us all as individuals, not just as courts, but even as courts. And as long as we adhere to the constitutional precepts and the underpinnings of the Constitution, we will be safe. But the moment we move away and allow the political polarization to permeate into our thinking, into our actions, into our judgments, into our conduct, and so on and so forth, I think we'll be making a huge suicidal move from which we essentially will not be able to recover. And I also believe that we need to seriously guard judicial independence by on each occasion and every occasion emphasizing the constitutional provisions which point to the independence of the judiciary, so as to keep the political boundaries away from the judiciary.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chief Justice. Judge, when you are currently on second unit in Lesotho, how do you expect to be on the Supreme Court bench when you are at the same time in Lesotho? Is the chairperson of you then cancelling your present engagement in Lesotho and coming to sit on the Supreme Court bench? Or is it a person of waiting until you come back?
Thank you, Commissioner Cheki. My secondment is attenuated and precise. Before I came here, I consulted the Chief Justice of Lesotho, and she advised me that in fact the secondment has now been reduced to only 18 months. And therefore, I think that depending on when I am required in the very likely event that I succeed in Singapore, depending on when I will be required to resume my duties on the Supreme Court bench, I will be able to make an approach to the Chief Justice of Lesotho as well as to the Honorable Chief Justice of Zimbabwe to see how that can be done. I am sure that if this has precedence, although it was a secondment, I'm aware that the Honorable Chief Justice and the Commissioner was also attached to the ICJ at some point, but it wasn't on secondment. And I believe that there could always be ways to go around the movement from the Lesotho to Harare.
Before your settlement to Lesotho, you were the head of the field for many years. That exposure, can you juxtapose it with the possibility of your appointment to the city?
I think that my exposure in the High Court, which spans 19 years in December, this December, 19 years in the High Court, has exposed me not just to the administration of judicial administration, but also the variety of measures that I have handled in the past 19 years and the sort of pressures that I have been subjected to, either individually or as a member of the court, and the sort of perceptions that I also now share about how well we can develop our
Yes, I was referring specifically to your experience as head of the appeals division in the High Court. How does that relate to your intended appointment in the Supreme Court? It doesn't give you any specific advantage different from anybody else in the High Court. You may wish to describe.
I think it does, especially in light of the fact that being head of the criminal appeals division, I was literally sitting as a Supreme Court judge, although of course it was just a panel of two in the Supreme Court, and the constitution that it would be a panel of three. So I'm already used to sitting in an appellate court setting.
What specifically in the appeals division is akin to what transpires in the Supreme Court? Is there anything that specifically says people who come from that division, they're acting or people who are in the civil division in general?
I can't think of any specific issue, but what comes to mind automatically is the ability to be able to implement the appeals rules, procedural rules in terms of how an appeal is to be brought and what issues are to be placed before any, how issues are placed or argued in an appeal court. You would know that during my tenure as the head of the appeals division, we carried out an exercise during which a lot of appeal matters were processed simply because we decided to religiously implement the provisions of Rule 22 sub Rule 1 of the Supreme Court, Magistrate Court's criminal appeals rules, which I think been put on the back burner previously, and that saw a lot of matters being processed and others being following the website was simply measure up to the required standard. And I think that when you read Rule 22 sub Rule 1, it's replicated in the Supreme Court rules, and therefore there won't be anything new for me when I sit on that bench to handle the practical application of that rule in hearings.
Yes, my next question is to do with improvements. You did mention in answer to, I think, Commissioner Mishi's question that the record is understaffed and therefore the judges are under pressure. What sort of changes would you want to see to improve that situation?
Is the improvements that I would recommend would be those that do not require funding. For instance, there is no reason at all why the regional magistrates division is not handling civil matters. There is a provision in the law for them to handle civil matters, but it's just not being done. Secondly, there is no reason why the regional magistrates are not handling mega cases, because the Constitution now does not grant for a death sentence to be imposed on mega cases, and therefore it is possible, as in South Africa, for regional magistrates to handle mega cases, thereby reducing the sort of burden that is being currently experienced in the region, on the High Court bench. And those two measures alone, to me, will go a long way without any cost on the service delivery. And it will also lift the sort of pressures that the High Court to do with continuous trials. Continuous civil trials could be handled, in my view, better by enforcing the pre-trial procedure rules to a point where we can get more settlements rather than allow matters to proceed to trial and needlessly. So those three suggestions, in my view, can go a long, long way to alleviate the burden on the High Court. Although, of course, the powers of the registrar of the High Court could be increased to allow them, or to allow them to enter the full judgment, which is right now a prison of the judge. Why the restraint the Supreme Court can handle those matters, but the restraint the High Court cannot do it, just escapes my mind.
Yes, my last question is, what are the major differences between the High Court
Yeah, there is the one major difference that they have, which I think we can learn from is about what they call pre-trial management, crime management conferences for criminal matters. It's a process which is like a pre-trial conference, but in a criminal setting, which should allow the judge to have a firm control of what's going to happen and when and how. We don't have the system here. All we do here is to get the prosecution publish the trial cause, and often though we don't know which places will be called and when. Only in certain matters when you are already seized with the matter, do the parties have a pre-bargaining conference where which might result in immediate charge being issued to cover. But in also, the judge would question both the prosecution and the defense in a meeting and say, look, what is the relevance of this witness if you want to prove A, B, C, D? And if you want to prove this, where is this witness? Because if you don't have that witness, you can't prove it. And why do you need this length of time to prove, for each court, so few witnesses? So to me, that I think is a procedure we should learn, and we should incorporate in our rules, in our Criminal Procedure Evidence Act or the High Court rules. Otherwise, they would have more stuff to learn from us, from my experience so far.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sinde. There are 4 other candidates being considered for appointment, and you are the judge. What do you consider to be your strength, which would make you the strongest candidate over the other candidates?
I'm not sure they asked me to blow my own trumpet, but the point is this. I'm the longest serving judge in the High Court presidency in Harare. To me, it says a lot. If I was not good enough, why am I still sitting there? So to me, that is the reason why I should be considered first. But of course, the other reasons I will need for you to go through my judgments as Commissioner Moses pointed out. Some of it who doesn't have good in the judgments.
My second and the last question is by way of follow-up question was asked by the Chief Justice regarding the
Yeah, it's not an easy process to balance the two principles, because the rule of law assumes and expects the maintenance of status quo, predictability, stability, stabilizes, and so on and so forth. So that a party who goes to court or comes to court will know that it's acting on the basis of the president. But I think also that when you read our constitution carefully, you get the feeling that the constitution is asking us not to be always backward looking, but to be forward looking. It sets for us on a journey of a democratic state. And that is why the constitution speaks of what would otherwise be acceptable in a democratic society. We are coming from an undemocratic past, and the constitution is a beacon which is guiding us towards a democratic future. And therefore, in my view, rather than emphasize those principles which take us back to look at our bad past, we should only accept the good from our past, which we can utilize to develop the future. And therefore, that is why I think when the Constitution speaks of the requirement of all courts to take into account foreign law, it is asking us to take those good aspects of foreign law, which will help us improve and move in a democratic direction. And therefore, it's always easier to balance those two.
Justice Mumwe, from your CV, I see that you have continuously professionally improved yourself, which is quite commendable.
Thank you.
You are aspiring to go to the Supreme Court. In your view, what do you take to the Supreme Court which you believe would add value to that court?
At the risk of repeating myself, you will notice I've attached one of my latest judgments. If you compare that judgment, those judgments I used to write, let's say 10 years ago, you see a constant movement towards self-actualization. And I think that a court like the Supreme Court requires people with a forward-looking vision. A vision that says we must be moving with the times. We must be amenable to criticism and also be able to improve ourselves, not just in acquiring degrees, but in applying the knowledge that we gather in this journey of life, and be able to share it with society and for the society's benefit.
My last question to you. As a Supreme Court judge, you may find yourself having to differ with your colleagues, and having to write what we call a dissenting judgment. What is the value of the dissenting judgment?
Thank you, Commissioner, for bringing that up. I was hoping that it would come up. There is nothing wrong in thinking differently from the next judge. And it is critically important that we don't think like sheep. What might not be acceptable today might be the in thing tomorrow. And therefore, a dissenting judgment is a constant reminder of what a future, a different future could hold if the particular position a law was adopted. And therefore, to me, it is important to always have, if one of us shares a different opinion, to have that difference recorded, so that probably, hopefully, if it is argued properly, it might be adopted. Who knows? And therefore, I think that there is so much value in dissenting judgments that we are all the poorer for the lack of them.
Just I need just to engage you on a few issues. Firstly, your explanation about the value of speedy delivery of judgments. You seem to rubbish or set a situation where you're saying the restriction, the time frame for delivering judgment really is not appropriate. We have here statistics that show that we have 8 reserved judgments which date in delay between 3 years and 7 months. Would this be a reflection of your attitude towards this principle that you were talking about?
No, so if I have the impression that time and delivery of judgment comes to nothing, I am sorry, that's not the impression that I wish to create. What I was responding to Commissioner Mrs. was what value should be attached to the timelines in terms of assessment. But I think it is important to have time judgments. It counts for everything, because otherwise the value of the judgment itself will be lost in time. So certainly that is not the impression that I wish to create. I was merely trying to say, besides, it's not the only measure of a good judge, because we know, as we see today, that even the Supreme Court itself has delayed judgments. But do we say that the Supreme Court is good for nothing? We are not by the issue. That's the only explanation I was trying to give. And I was saying that the 90-day period is the standard internationally, but it's not always adhered to for various reasons. And these are the reasons I was explaining to Commissioner. It was not meant to justify any delays at all. But as I say, those delays could be understood by the particular judge, as well as the judge or the judge.
You must take a break that the judgment that has been reserved by you for 3 years.
I never accept or deny that.
Sorry?
I am not aware, so I cannot say no or yes. Because I haven't seen
Why
those
would
statistics.
you not be aware, Judge?
No, because I haven't seen the statistics. It could be possible.
You are having the judgment. You are having the record.
No, I don't remember.
If you don't remember it, they are not there.
No, the length. I know there are outstanding judgments, yes. But it's the length that I'm saying I can't remember this 3 years. So I won't be able to dispute that.
With the statistics that came from the High Court, performance of judges, which I have, up to the 31st of May, clearly show that you did that. I'm not sure there's 2 more, but there are judgments, there are 8 judgments that are pending, and they range between 3 years to to get judgments in your hands.
Precisely, that's what I'm saying.
You are not, are we taking the reasons that you have given as the reasons for these judgments that you have not written? In other words,
No, I haven't even started to look at those judgments.
let's take the list that you have. I mean, you have the judgment.
Yes.
As a judge, I know.
Yeah,
I would know the judgments.
there are judgments which I've already put in the
So what explanation would you give to the public? What explanation are you having? That's what we're interested in.
Well,
These judgments that have not been written, what's the problem?
yeah, the problem is if I'm not clear on an issue, I'm not venture to give a judgment. Yes.
Now, there are 3 reviews. Those statistics also show you have 3 reviews pending finalization. And the delay is also something like 3 years. Do you remember that?
As I said, off the top, I can't remember, but should just know from your experience, reviews would delays reviews can arise in several ways. The most obvious one is if you write to a magistrate seeking his views before you make a judgment, it may not come in time, or if it comes, it may not come to your desk. But it will be paid with something. It will be either held up in the court of origin or in the register. So there are so many explanations for such a situation.
There may be done, but you are personally responsible for this. That's what I'm concerned about. I would have expected you to say, yes, I know these cases because there are these problems. But there are cases. Are you not following them? You don't have any record of them?
No, I have the record,
You have the record,
but I will not be able to say what the reason of a particular case would be without going back to my records.
Now, you seem to have taken a bit of a light approach to this case of Zibani, where you sought to suspend the operation of the constitutional provision. Can a judge ever think of doing that? Is that possible? That is what that case is about. That the judge being under the obligation of the rule of law and the Constitution being the supreme law, until it's amended, it has to be enforced. Now, that is the principle of that, that's the ratio of that case. You don't seem to have understood it like that. Is that what it is?
That was not really the point that was being made. And when the judgment emphasized that point, I totally agree with that principle. But what was before me was not a suspension of the constitutional provision.
But that was the effect of it.
No, I think maybe we need to look at our perceptions of whether it was the effect of my decision or the matter which was informed.
No, the effect of your decision. You are a judge. You must take into account the effect of the order. How do you make an order which has an effect of suspending the Constitution? The operation of the Constitution.
With all due respect, Honorable Chief Justice, I don't think I suspended the provision of the Constitution. Certainly not.
Anyway, we leave that. That case, you agree with me, involved passing of sentence. What was left there was just the passing of sentence.
Maybe he might have missed a lot of facts, and I will repeat those facts. The first thing that happened was that two of the lawyers were appearing for 3 accused were appearing before the one died soon after the first judgment. And then the case was postponed at the instance of the remaining lawyers, because one was going to Botswana, and then Congress fell in that accused them died in prison. And then that delayed the passing of sentence. Because I lost track of it. But when you see from the correspondence that I addressed to the registrar.
What do you mean you lost track of it?
No, because when I asked the registrar to give me a report, I did not get that report. And I was sent from the criminal division to the civil division, where I was dealing with different matters. And that matter was left in the criminal division, waiting for me to come back or to call it back. And my client was then transferred to the Supreme Court. And what it looked like I had no idea about this matter. And then the tapes were inadvertently erased. And then the record was stolen. And it disappeared. So, how could I know that this matter was still pending when I was now dealing with other matters? Because the prosecution never came to tell the judge, could you please make time for person of standing this matter?
We don't want to go into detail, but I'm a bit privy to those facts, because I was involved. It was a simple question of sentence. Now, delaying for 12 years, the person is in custody. That person was in custody. But there were letters being written.
Probably those letters never got to me because I would shut the matter up. The prosecutor was never even taken to task about this. Curiously, it was just me who was being targeted over this issue. I don't know why, but all I know is that when I said, no, I can reconstruct the record because I don't keep high court records. They are kept by the registry. The registry didn't have that record. I didn't have the record. So how was I expected, when I was moved to the civil division, to remember that there was an outstanding case which the prosecution was not eager to bring before me?
So you don't usually follow the cases that are partly here. You don't keep a record of what cases are before you as a judge to know your partly head matters.
Probably you may not be privy to the fact that during that time, the record keeping was not as good as it was now.
I'm not talking about the record keeping judge. That's an administrative issue. I'm talking about yourself.
Yes, I don't.
You're keeping a record of the cases that are before you, that you are here, where you have the responsibility of exercising the judicial power of sentencing the case. When you're keeping a record of those, it's your responsibility.
What happens is this: when you pass a judgment in a criminal matter, and there's an application being placed before you, what happened in that case was that judgment is transcribed, if I remember very well. That is how the matter goes out of my hand, out of my office. And that is why I was writing to the registrar to please let me have that judgment. And in between, that is when I was transferred from the criminal division to the civil division. And my client would have the record because usually what we do is we don't keep all those records in our office. The client keeps those records so that they can follow up when you ask them. But once the client was transferred to the Supreme Court, the new client was totally unaware and there was also lacking in other measures.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swingle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we will come to the end of your interview. You may stand. standard questions that I'll put to you before I hand you over to the other commissioners to put questions, if they so wish. Before I do so, I notice you brought the card box. I'm not quite sure what it is. I see it's full of files. And the books and the other books on the side of the box. What do you intend to do?
It was in that, it was in anticipation of the question I'm sure I would ask.
Unfortunately, we won't allow that because we have not allowed that advantage to other candidates. Questions are never anticipated. You just give answer and they come. So it's unfortunate we have to order that the box is removed, the part of the box and the books also removed. Yes, before we, yes, just remove it. Before we do that, are you feeling well? Yes, we need to. Are you all right? Are you feeling all right? I know you have not been feeling well, in the sense that it may be physical. I know you have not been feeling well. You were hospitalized at that time. Have you fully recovered physically and mentally?
Covered, let us say, fully, we are able to participate in the interview.
Are you sure you will be able to participate? Because we don't want to put you under pressure necessarily. I know you have voluntarily come, but these are it's a pressurized environment. I need to say you know that.
Yes, I do.
So that we don't want to place you in a disadvantage unnecessarily. These things may come as another point. It's not the end of it. But it's up to you if you feel you are able to go through the interview. You say so.
Thank you, and I think I would be happy to discuss it.
You want to proceed?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. The first question is as follows. Supreme Court decisions become part of the law of the land. Supreme Court judges should therefore be thinking of making law and not simply deciding matters before them on appeal. How does this statement affect the application of the principle of the rule of law by the Supreme Court?
I suppose it would be very rare cases that would happen. Because I think it is difficult even for the Supreme Court to make rule law. Law is developed over time. And it is built on the shoulders of other judges, predecessors of the Supreme Court who have gone before it.
quite one. It's almost like an elephant. You know what it is. It's difficult to describe it. But it entails following both the substantive and procedural rules that are in place and applying the effects of a particular appeal to those principles. I think that would be the response that I'm able to give.
That's all for the first question. The second question is as follows. State 3 fundamental principles governing the exercise of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. State 1, each principle is important in defining the relationship between the Supreme Court and other courts. State 3 fundamental principles governing the exercise of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. State 1, each principle is important